I will begin this evening sort of off the cuff, just in worship, as I was obviously preparing to come up here and share what I have prepared. I just got thinking about why even talk about, apologetics, reasonable answers for our faith, the existence of God, theism versus atheism, etc. Why even take the time to talk about it? As we said last week, it's important, number one, to be ready always. Somebody say always. That's what Peter told us in the New Testament. He said, be ready always to give an answer, an apologia, a reasonable defense. So it's a scriptural command that we are ready to give an answer. That's first and foremost. But the secondary thing, and maybe not secondary to that completely, but a second thing I should say, is that if there is a God, if we are not just random happenstance in the universe, or as some people like to say, in infinite amount of universes, as we discussed and discovered last week, if there really is a God, and if we really are a product of His creative hand and His design, His handiwork, He demands our servitude, our allegiance, and our very lives. Paul said, I beseech you therefore, brethren, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice unto God, holy and acceptable. And this is just your reasonable service. If there is a God, my life is due Him. My service is due Him. My love and my affection and my energy is due Him, if there really is a God. And one of the reasons I think that, atheism is on the rise, the Apostle Paul talked about how in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves. And really, I don't believe that in the 21st century, the new atheism that is out there, it's not that they're trying to say that there isn't a God. They're trying to say, I would say, they're just trying to shift who God is to self. Men shall be lovers of their own selves. And if there isn't a God, I am completely free to be my own God and do my own thing and live life. And I've heard it said several times in study, people really aren't on a truth quest, because there's much evidence for God. In fact, and I'm way off my notes, I apologize. Christopher Hitchens, who is a well-renowned atheist who's now passed on, his whole worldview, it's not that he has a bunch of evidence for, the non-existence of God. In his own admission, he just says, I don't have enough conclusive evidence for God. In other words, it's just that he doesn't have enough to validate this worldview. It's not like he has this great conclusive evidence for atheism. As we said last week, atheism in many cases takes more faith than theism. It takes a whole lot more faith to believe in, infinite universes, as opposed to one that we have some question marks about. Would you not agree? Right? So it's this whole idea that people are shifting from a true God to themselves as being God. People are not really on a truth quest. Evidence really does not convince people. Many people are just on a happiness quest. And I'm not against people being happy, but sometimes we put our happiness and our preferences on the back burner as we submit our lives to a greater authority, which is God. I don't know why I'm saying all that. Maybe I should move on to my notes, but that's why we discuss this. Because if there is a God, He deserves my very life. And I know I'm in a room full of people that already believe that. So you might as well say amen. So tonight, I said it last week, I really wanted in this series to give you nice, neat, wrapped packages with pretty bows in the realm of apologetics. Things that, you could take these like 3 lessons or 4 lessons and you could conquer the world and make everybody believe in God. I found out very quickly that there's such a plethora of information. There's so many rabbit trails we could go down. And to give you, just like even a handful of the arguments for God, for a creator, it would be like a year-long series. There's so much we could talk about. So I've tried to narrow it down. Last week we talked about a couple great arguments for the existence of God. We talked about the complexity of our universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, how it points toward an intelligent designer. We also pointed toward, through the second video we watched, the complexity of our own DNA and our own bodies. And the thought of that happening just by chance is crazy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. Tonight we're going to really get into evolution versus creation. And I'm going to answer 4 questions. And most of them, I would say probably all of them, at least to some degree, are in the realm of evolution versus creation. All right, you ready? How many have had a class in school, a science class, no doubt, that has really declared evolution as like the paradigm? It's like, I think that evolution, in one way, it's not just a scientific theory. It's become almost like a religion for some people in some ways. So I'm going to give you a few arguments against evolution, for creationism, and we could, again, cover so much more than this. If you want some good resources, I suggest Case for a Creator, Lee Strobel, great documentary. We're going to watch a clip of that tonight. But let's just get into it. A strong argument against evolution, which we will watch a clip from A Case for a Creator. It's the concept of irreducible complexity. Okay, can you say irreducible complexity? In essence, this concept suggests that complex systems in our universe could not have evolved over time, but they all had to come into being at one time. With so many moving parts and so many variables and so many factors, it would be difficult for one thing to evolve and then the next thing to evolve. The question would arise, why would the first thing evolve if it played a direct role with the second thing? And it can get confusing. But everything had to come into being at one time. If one piece was missing, then the whole system would not work. A simple example that I could think of, and the video will explain it even greater, but you've seen that crowd breaker exercise where people stand in a circle and they're facing each other's back, a bell rings, and everybody has to sit down at the exact same moment. Do you know what I'm talking about? And if everybody sits at the exact same moment, then everybody is like sitting on the knees of the person behind them, and the whole circle remains intact. But if just one guy, it's probably going to be Riley. I'm just kidding, Riley. If just one guy, it's probably not going to be Riley. It'll probably be me. Waits like a second because he doesn't trust that the guy in front of him is not going to sit down at the right time. He messes it up for everybody, and everybody falls over. Everything has to come together simultaneously and begin working simultaneously. And that's the concept of irreducible complexity. If you remove just one element, as we're about to see from a single-celled organism like the cells with a flagella, like the propeller on the back, you remove just one element and the whole system doesn't work. Irreducible complexity. So I'm going to get them to roll the clip, bring down the lights. Let's check it out.
Today, powerful technologies reveal elaborate microscopic worlds. Worlds so small that a thimbleful of cultured liquid can contain more than 4 billion single-cell bacteria, each packed with circuits, assembly instructions, and miniature machines, the complexity of which Charles Darwin could never have imagined. One machine particularly attracted his attention.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor and so on. I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Behe's reaction was not surprising. For the molecular motors that drive bacteria through liquid, each depend upon a system of intricately arranged mechanical parts. These parts come into focus when portions of a cell are magnified 50,000 times. Biochemists have used electron micrographs like this one to identify the parts and three-dimensional structure of the flagellar motor. In the process, they have revealed a marvel of engineering on a miniaturized scale.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
And even though they're spinning that fast, they can stop on a dime. It only takes a quarter turn for them to stop and shift directions and start spinning 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
And just like outboard motors on motorboats, it has a large number of parts which are necessary for the motor to work.
The bacterial flagellum, 2 gears, forward and reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force. It has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller, and they function as these parts of machines. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
Since its discovery, scientists have tried to understand how a rotary motor could have arisen through natural selection. As yet, they have failed to offer any detailed Darwinian explanation. To see why, we must understand a feature of molecular machines known as irreducible complexity.
Irreducible complexity was coined by Mike Behe in describing these molecular machines. Basically what it says is that you have multi-component parts to any given organelle or system in a cell, all of which are necessary for function. That is, if you remove one part, you lose function of that system.
The idea of irreducible complexity can be illustrated by a familiar, non-biological machine, a mousetrap. The trap is composed of 5 basic pieces: a catch to hold the bait, a strong spring, a thin bent rod called the hammer, a holding bar to secure the hammer in place, and a platform upon which the entire system is mounted. If any one of these parts is missing or defective, the mechanism will not work. All components of this irreducibly complex system must be present simultaneously for the machine to perform its function, catching mice. Irreducible complexity also applies to biological machines, including the bacterial flagellar motor.
All told, there are about 40 different protein parts which are necessary for this machine to work. And if any of those parts are missing, then either you get a flagellum that doesn't work because it's missing the hook or it's missing the drive shaft or whatever, or it doesn't even get built within the cell.
In evolutionary terms, you have to be able to explain how you can build this system gradually when there's no function until you have all those parts in place.
But could Darwin's small, favorable variations have produced a bacterial flagellum? Some scientists doubt the possibility.
How could something new, like a bacterioflagellar motor and all of the components that go with it, how could it develop out of a population of bacteria that don't have that system? When each change, according to Darwin's theory, has to provide some kind of advantage.
All right. Hope that makes sense. No or yes? Yes, okay. I thought I heard a no. So just to sum it up really quick, a cell is one of the most basic biological structures that we can observe and study, and yet, of course, it's immensely complex. Just a regular cell. I mean, this is a bacterial flagellum, but you talk about one of your cells, eukaryotic, is that what they're called? I remember that from high school and a video I saw earlier. But there's the mitochondria, there's the cell wall, there's a dozen other parts, many other parts, that's all I remember. And yet it all works together. How can you have everything coming together gradually? And that's their argument. If the flagellum, just the propeller, developed first, what function would it serve without a drive shaft and the rest of the motor? It would just sit there useless beside the bacterial flagellum, and therefore, by the theory of natural selection evolution, it would just go away over time because it doesn't serve a function or a purpose. So you can see how things just don't really come together in layers. It has to come together simultaneously. So this lends itself to an instantaneous creator and not the evolution of billions of years. And that's the idea of irreducible complexity. So that's question number 1 that was kind of brought up. Does that sound good? Okay, so another question that came in. By the way, if you have questions throughout tonight, if something comes to your mind, write it down so you don't forget, because we didn't have very many questions. We had enough to cover tonight. But submit questions. Go to our website and you can submit them anonymously. So if something came from nothing, which is a statement that was made last week, then what about God? Fair question. To answer this question, I would like to bring in one of the leading voices for creationism, Dr. William Lane Craig. This is also 5 minutes. I do have some comments after it. After this, there's not another video for quite a while, so don't feel like we're going to be too video heavy. Go ahead and roll this clip.
One of the most remarkable facts about modern physics is that, in contrast to scientists of bygone days, modern science believes that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had a beginning a finite time ago. The controlling paradigm of modern astrophysics, which is the study of the universe as a whole, is that the universe began in an event called the Big Bang about 14 billion years ago. And I think that most lay people don't understand that, according to this theory, not simply all matter and energy, but physical space and time themselves came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. So that the Big Bang represents literally the origin of the universe out of nothing. Now, the difficulty is, of course, that out of nothing, nothing comes. To say that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of nothing would be worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, at least you've got the magician, not to mention the hat. But on atheism, you have to say that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing, which is surely absurd. So that it seems to me far more rational to say that there is a transcendent cause of the universe which brought it into existence.
You've got a great illustration of what you're talking about using a balloon.
It's very important to understand that on the Big Bang model, the theory is not that the material universe is expanding into a pre-existing empty space. Rather, according to this model, space and time themselves come into being at the Big Bang. And a very good way to visualize this is by imagining a balloon with buttons pasted onto the surface of the balloon. Now, the buttons are glued in place, so they don't move relative to the surface of the balloon. But as you blow up the balloon, the buttons will get further and further and further apart because the surface of the balloon is expanding. Now, the surface of the balloon is just like our three-dimensional space. As space expands, the galaxies get further and further and further apart. Now, this has the radical implication that as you trace the expansion back in time, they get closer and closer and closer together until at some point in the finite past, the entire universe is contracted down to a single point before which it literally did not exist. So that the controlling paradigm of contemporary cosmology is that the universe began to exist out of nothing about 14 billion years ago. And therefore we're thrust into the question of why did the origin of the universe occur? What brought the universe into being?
Why is this a good reason that God exists?
Well, what it points to is a transcendent cause of the physical universe. And when you reflect on what properties such a cause would have to have, a number of very theologically significant attributes fall out. For example, this would have to be an uncaused being. It would have to be non-physical and immaterial because it created all the matter in the universe. It would have to be non-temporal, that is to say timeless, because it created time as well as space. It would therefore have to be changeless. It would have to be enormously powerful in order to bring the universe into existence. So how can you get a temporal effect with a beginning from a permanent eternal cause? I can think of only one answer to that, and that is if the cause is a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will, who can therefore create a new effect without any prior determining conditions. For example, a man sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up. And so you would have a new effect arise from an eternal cause. And so we're brought not simply to a transcendent cause of the universe, but but to its personal creator.
So essentially, we would say the question again, if something can't come from nothing, then what about God? So something cannot simply come from nothing for no reason, no matter, and in the case, again, of cosmologists, people that theorize about the origins of the universe, time and space itself. It is reasonable to suggest that there had to be a transcendent cause, something beyond all these forces, something beyond time, something beyond matter, something beyond space, that was the cause for the formation of the universe, the Big Bang, or whatever you'd like to call it. God meets the criteria of what this cause might be, and he laid out a bunch of the criteria there. Just to name a few, God, again, is timeless. He's an eternal being. God is changeless. God has no cause. Theologians would say he's the uncaused cause. He's the uncreated creator. God is powerful, etc. It still doesn't really answer the question, though. If something cannot come from nothing, then what about God? Where did he come from? Well, I would say to that, again, the Bible declares that he is Alpha, Omega. He is the beginning and he is the end. He really has no limits. He's eternal, outside of time. So I really think that to ask me where God came from is an unfair question. In fact, I would say who made God is not even worth asking, because even if I were able to tell you where God came from, if there was such an answer, then the first thing you would do thereafter is ask me who made the who that made God. And suppose I could give you an answer, who made the who that made God. You want to know what the first thing you'd ask me after that would be? Who made the who that made the who that made God? And we would do this for eternity. And we could not get to the end of the chain of questions. So at some point, you've got to come to the realization that there had to be a transcendent personal being that was uncreated, that had no conception or beginning, that brought about the inception of the universe. The only logical explanation is that there is a transcendent being that meets those qualifications, and it is the God that is described to us in the Bible. Okay, we have 3 more questions to get to. You guys good? You find this informational, entertaining? Good? Good? All right. Evolutionists, they claim that the earth is billions of years old. He said in that video 14 some billion years old. I've read 4.5 billion years old. It's all hypothesis. Nobody really knows for sure. Yet according to the scripture, we only have roughly 6,000 years worth of human history. If you calculate from the time of creation and Adam, the 6th day, if you will, until now, we have roughly 6,000 years of human history. And so who is right? Is the earth 4.5, 14 billion years old, 5 trillion years old, or is it 6,000 years old? There are some Christians who believe that the earth is, in fact, 6,000 years old. It's called, the young earth theory, whatever. People like Ken Ham, for example, who is he the Answers in Genesis guy? He's the guy that built the Ark Experience, the Ark Encounter, down in the States, debated Bill Nye a couple years ago. He actually believes in a young earth, okay? However, the Bible does not necessarily support this view. When you add up all the generations, all the lifespans of biblical characters, yes, the sum total is 6,000 years. However, that does not necessarily mean that that's the age of the earth, okay? The lifespan or the time frame of humanity is not necessarily the same as the age of the earth. And so rather than give you arguments for one view or the other because they are plenteous, I want to simply illustrate that the Bible could potentially support an earth that is billions of years old. And that theory is called the gap theory. Touch your neighbor, say the gap theory. How many have heard of the gap theory before? Okay, you've heard the term. Could you explain it? All right, well, I'll try my best. So you go right back to the beginning of your Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form, and it was void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And of course, in the very next verse, God gives the command, let there be light. There was light. And this sets off a 6-day creation period at the end of which God rested. You follow me? Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:2, and then 6 days of creation and then rest. Now, some theorize that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there could potentially be billions of years. And here's why they say that. Isaiah 45:18 is a great example and points us in the right direction. It says, "For thus saith the Lord, the God that created the heavens." Somebody say, He created it. God Himself that formed the earth and made it. Somebody say, He made it. He hath established it. He established it. He created it not in vain. Vain. That word vain in the Hebrew is tohu, and that means desolation, wilderness, confusion, and emptiness. And it's the same word that is translated in Genesis 1 and 2 as without form. Okay? The Bible tells us in Genesis 1 and 2 that the world was tohu, or empty and desolate. But Isaiah 45 tells us that it wasn't created in tohu, or in emptiness. So what's happening? How do we reconcile these two verses? 1 and 2, Genesis 1 and 2. And the earth was without form and void. It was tohu. That word was in the Hebrew. I know sometimes maybe you guys are like, oh, we're going into the original text, the language, this is over my head. You know, we don't understand always in the English translation of the Bible what the Bible really is saying. And you've got to go to the original language sometimes. This is a great example. So was is the Hebrew word haya. Somebody say haya. That's how you say it. It's haya, which is absolutely hilarious. Thank you, Cliff. So haya means be, become, or come to pass. Okay? Become or come to pass. Sorry, became, become, or come to pass. 133 other times in the Old Testament, the word haya is translated as became or become. And so it's not an anomaly. It's throughout the whole Old Testament. And so you could literally read Genesis 1 and 2 as, and the earth became without form and void. Okay, so God did not create the earth in chaos and confusion. He didn't create it formless and void. Isaiah 45 tells us that. God does not create things in this fashion. He is not the author of confusion. That's what the Bible says. He doesn't author things or create things in confusion. And so something must have taken place between verses 1 and 2 that caused it to become this way, because it became. If something became, there was a cause or there was a process. Would you not agree? Okay, so how long was this period of time between these two verses? We have no idea. It could have been a day. I don't know. I want to say likely not, but I don't know what I'm basing my likely on. It could have been 4.5 billion years. It could have been 14 billion years. It could have been whatever period of time. We have no sweet clue. Some theologians, they would suggest, the question arises, well, what happened between these two verses? Some would suggest that maybe, and I'll conclude with this thought, maybe it was the casting down of Lucifer and a third of heaven's angels that caused this process of deterioration. Now, we won't take the time to get into all the scriptures that talk about, Satan being cast out of heaven and his uprising against God and all that kind of stuff. We won't take the time. But it may be a plausible cause for the earth becoming formless and void. So, when Jesus says in the Gospels, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven, it very well could have happened. We know it had to happen. Angels are created at some point. If angels were created at that initial Genesis 1 and 1 creation, we also know that the casting down had to happen before the creation of man. And so it reasons that Satan would have been cast down between these two verses. And maybe through the process of time and his evil influence in the earth, in God's creation, is what made it become this way. Okay, it's a very plausible theory, which really, all I'm doing is illustrating to you that the age of the earth, it really could be billions of years old, and we don't need to stand on our soapbox and fight on a molehill about the age of the earth. It really doesn't matter. Okay, it really doesn't matter, and we're not going to contradict all the science. Some creationists, they try to, combat, the carbon dating method is wrong. The carbon dating method is wrong, and it very well may be, but it very well may not be. I'm not a carbon dating expert, but we don't want to look crazy and stupid if we don't have to. The Bible does not say the earth is only 6,000 years old, all right? You good? Okay, 2 more questions, and then we will be done. If some aspects of evolution are accurate and true, what are they, and how do they complement God's creation? Okay, are there any elements of evolution that's true? And I do have a guest that is going to attack this question and bring an answer, and it's the one and only Aunt McAfee. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Aunt. He told me he would be no more than 8 minutes, but he's going to try for 5.
Right.
Yeah. Are there any aspects of evolution that are accurate or true? Like, can Christians believe in any element of it, like adaptation? Is that true? You know, stuff like that.
If you will, you can look at evolution as a broad spectrum of definitions. On one end, you have soft evolution, that's adaptation, that's species change a little bit, but not too much. On the other end, you have hardcore evolution, where you had a microbe thousands of years ago and it has now evolved into all the living things in the world. Where should we lie on this spectrum? Where do we draw the line? The answer that we've come up with is we draw the line at the point where it is suggested that a simple creature could become a complex creature by the introduction of new DNA to the system. And I will explain all those words here in a moment. First of all, simple and complex. We are creatures made up of billions of cells. Each one of you is made of billions of individual cells. Bacterium, made up of 1. Bacterium is simple, we are complex. To further explain, I need to define some terms about DNA. All those billions of cells that you're made up of, for those who haven't taken a grade 11, grade 12 science class yet, contain a core which contains DNA. That DNA is an instruction manual for the cell. Where does it go? What does it do? What does it make? DNA determines what color your eyes are, how long your hair is, how tall you are. It is the instruction manual for you. It is everything that defines you physically, at least. So it would stand to reason that if this DNA changes, the organism, you, would change as well. Evolution is the change over time, evolution is the change of a species over time, so it's important to look at DNA for this. DNA can change one of 3 ways. There is reorganization of the DNA, deletion of the DNA, and there is exchange of DNA. I'll start with exchange of DNA. The exchange of genetic material, or DNA, between 2 organisms is also known as sex. This is where the male and the female both contribute DNA, and bits are mixed and matched. They are exchanged between each other. The new organism that is produced is a mix of the 2, but it's still the same species. Yes, DNA has been changed, and here's the key. No new DNA has been added. It's just been mixed up. The next bit, reorganization. Let's say a segment of that DNA code accidentally gets placed somewhere else. The code that tells your nose where to go on your face accidentally gets placed so that your nose ends up on your forehead. You're no more a complex organism than anybody else. It's just different. No new DNA has been added. Underscore, bold, italicize. The last one is deletion, where the code is deleted. To use the last example, you're born without a nose. Very simple. No new DNA has been added. In fact, you are a less complex organism. To give an example of how this can be confusing at times, creatures can seem to become more complex when really they haven't. There is a certain gene that controls how many fingers you have on your hand. And no joke, the technical term for this gene, this section of DNA, is the Sonic the Hedgehog gene. Literally, that is what it is called in the textbooks. It determines how many fingers, how many limbs, how many appendages you have. If this gene is not left on for long enough in your mother's womb, you might be born with only 3 fingers. If it's left on for too long, you might be born with 6. Now, the person born with 6 fingers may appear to be more complex because there's more to them, right? But no, it's just that the Sonic the Hedgehog gene has been slightly rearranged. Looks more complex, but on the genetic level, it's just as simple. To restate the answer to the question, we draw the line at the point where They suggest that a simple organism can become complex through the introduction of new DNA to the system. There is no proof, there are no examples of new DNA being added to the system. It just does not exist. However, we draw the line at this point, and this line includes things like adaptation. It includes things like species changing over time. I mean, just look at dogs. How much have dogs changed over the past 1,000 or 2 years? A whole lot. Species absolutely do change. This is not some aberrant thing for Christians to believe in adaptation and species changing. In fact, it is a testament to God's artistic and engineering ability. He knows that these environments that he's created are going to change over time. He knows that continents shift and move to the poles and to the equator. He knows things like floods and volcanoes are going to change the environments that these creatures are living in, and to preserve them, they must change and they must adapt. It also speaks to his artistic intent in that, look at the diversity of creation. How many flowers are there? How many animals are there? How many colors are there? It's beautiful, and it's all what God designed.
That was awesome. I think you should do another question next week. Maybe all of them. That would be great. Should I just not talk anymore? I don't know. I just feel like I don't have anything else to add. Certainly not to that question. One last question that I would like to cover, and this is one that was asked, and I thought it was a very, very good question. And it was basically, if we believe in an intelligent designer, which is what we claimed last week, the theory of intelligent design, a creator, what about the things in creation that don't seem so intelligent? What about the imperfections of the universe? Why would, for example, an intelligent creator give unused appendages to animals, which is something that evolutionists argue all the time? Now this argument, it's not the unused appendage argument, it's called the vestigial organ argument. Somebody say vestigial organ. Okay, so in essence, here's the argument. It argues that because we see organs in various mammals and in humans that are unused and what they would call unnecessary, they must be remnants of body parts from previous evolutionary stages that we stopped needing, which therefore points to, in their mind and in their opinion, evolution. And so if we are in fact created by an intelligent God, why would these vestigial organs be present? Great question. So first of all, let me give you some background. The word vestige is derived from the Latin word vestigium, which literally means a footprint. Okay, so if I were to say something like there's not a vestige of hope, I'm saying there's not even like a little bit of hope. So it's vestigium, it's footprint, it's a trace of evidence. In the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it defines a biological vestige as a bodily part or organ that is small and degenerate or imperfectly developed in comparison to one more fully developed in an earlier stage of evolution of the individual or in a past generation or in a closely related form. For example, if they were to find something in humans that looks a little underdeveloped, the tailbone or the coccyx is a good example of that. They say that that is the remnants of a monkey tail. So we have a relative, so-called, that has a tail. We have a remnant of a tail. That's a vestigial organ in our body. If God created us with something that looks like a tail, that doesn't sound intelligent. That's their argument. And they say it points toward evolution. Charles Darwin, you ever heard of him? Okay, good. Charles Darwin was perhaps the first to claim that vestigial organs were evidence for evolution. In chapter 13 of his Origin of Species book, Darwin discussed what he called rudimentary, atrophied, and aborted organs. And he described these organs as bearing the plain stamp of inutility or uselessness, and he said that they're extremely common and even general throughout nature, and that is true. These so-called unused organs, they do appear often, at least the ones that they point out. Darwin speculated that these rudimentary organs once served a function necessary for survival, but over time that function became either diminished or non-existent, and they're just kind of on their way out, I guess. In Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, he claimed about a dozen of man's anatomical features to be useless, including things like the muscles in your ear. Why do you need those? Wisdom teeth. We get them pulled and it's painful. The appendix, which wants to explode and kill you every once in a while. The coccyx, the tailbone, I already mentioned that. Body hair, like on your arms, the small hair, even hair on your head, and the semilunar fold in the corner of your eye. To Darwin, these things were strong evidence that man had evolved from primitive ancestors that, for example, monkeys, they needed hair to keep them warm on all appendages and parts of their body. So we evolved from things like that, supposedly. The list of vestigial organs, it grew from Darwin's dozen or so to nearly 200 in the ensuing years through to the early 1900s. So, they kept on pointing out things, this is useless, this is useless. However, as science has progressed, the list of vestigial organs has not grown, but it has decreased as we understand more and more about the biology of animals and the actual function of these supposed useless organs in the human body. In other words, I hope I'm not losing you. In other words, the progression of science, it has diminished and disproven this theory, not the other way around. It's still quoted in textbooks. You've probably heard about it if you're in a biology class in, later high school or whatever. And I know, not to single you, I know Matt brought this argument from, a professor, basically, that said, what about the unintelligible things that God has supposedly created? But science has diminished this argument, which is interesting. So a couple issues I'll bring up with this theory, nearing an end. First of all, if an organ is truly useless, why does it persist at all? Darwin himself pointed out a flaw in the vestigial organ argument, and he wondered how once an organ is rendered useless, how it can continue to be further reduced in size. Why does it shrink at all? It should either in some way stay or be gone quicker. In chapter 14 of The Origin of Species, the chapter after the one that we just mentioned, 13, where he pointed out this theory, he said it is scarcely possible that disuse can go on producing any further effect after the organ has once been rendered functionless. And he said, and I quote, "Some additional explanation is here required, which I cannot give you." Why, indeed, would useless organs continue to exist for millions of years after they ceased to have any selective advantage? That's a great question, one that he could not answer, and it's a problem with this theory. And the second thing, how can we be certain an organ is in fact useless? The problem with declaring any organ to be without function is discriminating between truly functionless organs and those that have functions that we just simply don't know yet. Indeed, over the years, nearly all of the organs that once were thought to be useless have been found to be functional. Again, the list has shrunk. And I would like to say, when we have no evidence for the function of an organ, it is well to bear in mind that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. In other words, just because we don't have enough evidence to prove a function, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have one. It just means, at least, that we don't know what it is yet. Okay? So, those are issues with the argument. I want to give you a reason why vestigial organs exist or are present. One great illustration, or one great reason why, is what people would call homology. Okay? Many vestigial organs are examples of homology, but not necessarily of evolution. And homology is basically an underlying similarity between different kinds of animals. Go ahead and throw the picture up. Different kinds of animals recognized by both evolutionists and creationists. So all terrestrial vertebrates, for example, share a widespread homology or similarity of body parts. Now, evolutionists insist that the similarity is a result of evolution from a common ancestor. Creationists, on the other hand, argue that the similarity reflects the theme of a common creator and the need to meet similar biological requirements. So, great point here. Evolutionists, they tend to focus on the similarities. One big bone up top, 2 bones on the lower arm, 5 digits. Similarity must be evolution, common ancestor. Creationists, they say, well, we focus on the differences. My arm is not like a whale fin or a frog's leg or a horse's leg. The differences are great, and the similarities just show a common designer. And I'm going to show a video in a second, and he makes this point, so I don't want to belabor it too much, but in the same way that we wouldn't look at a Honda Civic and a Honda Accord, which have interchangeable parts, we wouldn't look at those two cars and say, oh, well, they must have evolved from a common ancestor, the skateboard. We understand that there's an intelligent designer that has a common theme or thread throughout their products. Now, he's going to make that point. Pretend that I said it first, okay? So, for example, all vertebrates with true limbs, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, have the same basic limb structure, at least during their embryological development. The standard vertebrate limb consists of an upper limb, one bone, lower bone. I don't want to get into all this. Thus, the limbs of all limbed vertebrates share fundamental similarities, with each being specialized to meet the needs of each species. Again, evolutionists, they look at the similarities. We look at the differences, and we recognize the similarities point to a creator. I want to show you this video. This is a great argument against vestigial organs. This is the last thing we're going to do. I have no other notes after this. So let's take a look. This is interesting.
This textbook says the appendix is vestigial. This is ludicrous, okay? This is a lie. The appendix is not vestigial. You do need your appendix, okay? The appendix is part of your immune system. It's true you can live without it. You can also live without both your legs and both your arms and both your eyes. That doesn't prove you don't need them, okay? If your appendix is taken out, you have a much better chance of getting quite a few diseases, and something else in the immune system has to work harder. It's like losing a finger. You can still have a grip, but now the rest of the fingers have to work harder. If somebody tells you the appendix is vestigial, they are either confused about their anatomy or they're lying to you, but it's not true. This textbook says the whale has a vestigial pelvis. This is one that he brought up earlier about the whale having a vestigial pelvis. Now, hold on a minute. National Center for Science Education, they teach the people that cows evolved to whales, bossy to blowhole. Well, here's their evidence. Whales have a vestigial pelvis and leg bone that serve no purpose. Just imagine the hind limb bones that have no function, the textbook says. Imagine whales walking around. It's true. Here's the bones they're talking about right there. You can see them at your Los Angeles Museum right down the road here. Those are the bones. Yes, just imagine the whale walking around. This textbook says the whale's pelvis is located far from the vertebra and has no apparent function. The whale's pelvis is evidence of its evolution from four-legged land-dwelling mammals. This is a lie. Those bones are anchor points that special muscles attach to. And without those special bones and those special muscles, the whales cannot reproduce. Male and female whales have different bones in that region to support different muscles for different reasons. This has nothing to do with walking on land. It has to do with getting baby whales. Okay? So the people that are writing this in the textbooks are either ignorant of whale anatomy or they're lying trying to push their theory. I hope they're just ignorant. That we can fix. If they're lying, they ought to get a different job picking peaches or changing tires. They got no business taking tax dollars to lie to the kids coming through their class. It says these bones resemble those of other mammals, but they are weakly developed in the whale and have no apparent function. This is a college biology book. This guy ought to be fired. He doesn't understand his whale anatomy. They're teaching this stuff like it's some kind of fact. Is this a university to get educated, or are you just getting indoctrinated in a theory? Okay? We could talk all day about the whale anatomy. He mentioned about the snake. I happen to have a 15.5-foot python snake skin in my museum in Pensacola, Florida. If you look at the south end of that python, you will see it has two little bitty claws. Those claws are attached to little tiny bones going up inside the snake's body. That's a fact, okay? They have them. Textbook says these are rudimentary hind legs of a python snake. He mentioned that earlier, that the snake pelvis is evidence for evolution. Look, those little claws and those little bones have nothing to do with walking on land. The snakes use those claws in mating, okay? They don't have any arms, all right? And they can't talk. They can't talk and say, squirt over, honey, okay? This has nothing to do with walking on land. So the people that are saying the snake has a vestigial leg are ignorant of snake anatomy or are lying trying to push a theory off. Okay, but it's not true. They use those bones and those little muscles. This textbook says humans have a tailbone that is of no apparent use. It says the vestigial tailbone in humans is homologous to the functional tail of other primates. Thus, vestigial structures can be viewed as evidence for evolution. You can rewind the tape and see that's what he said in his opening comments. One of the evidences for evolution is vestigial structures. I would like to point out, Your Honor, vestigial structures is losing something, not gaining something. How can that be evidence for evolution? How did you get it to begin with? Secondly, the tailbone is not vestigial. One guy told me, he said, up at Berkeley, he said, I think the tailbone is vestigial. I said, well, I taught biology and anatomy. I happen to know there are 9 little muscles that attach to the tailbone, without which you cannot perform some valuable functions. I won't tell you what they all are, but trust me, you need those muscles. Get your Gray's Anatomy. Now, if you believe the tailbone is vestigial, then I will pay to have yours removed. Okay? Bend over. This textbook says the coccyx is a small bone at the end of the human vertebral column. It has no present function and is thought to be the remainder of bones that once occupied the long tail of a tree-living ancestor. Either these authors are ignorant of anatomy or they're lying. I don't see another option, okay? If you know of one, please let me know. But it's not true that they're vestigial. And even if there were vestigial structures, that is the opposite. He mentioned that the human eye is poor design because the blood vessels are in front of the rods and cones. Well, the fact of the matter is, we live in the air, okay? Air is a poor insulator for UV light. Your body's last defense against ultraviolet light is a layer of blood vessels in front of the retina to protect the rods and cones from UV light. Some people say octopus. One atheist I debated in New York said octopus have a much better eye because their blood vessels are behind the retina. Ours are wired backwards. It's poor design. I said, well, sir, octopus live in the water. Okay? Water blocks UV light. They don't need their blood vessels in front. So if you want to swap eyes with an octopus, you just go ahead, but you're going to be blind in a few days. We're designed for living in the air, and they're designed for living in the water. And I think the eye is incredibly designed. I'm sick and tired of them lying to support their theory. Don't tell me about the vestigial structures. What evidence do you have to show us evolution? Not homology. Similar bone structures in the arms he mentioned earlier. Yeah, that proves a common designer. The Honda Prelude and the Honda Accord have quite a few interchangeable parts. Doesn't prove they both came from a skateboard. They have a common designer, okay? So all the evidence I've seen he's presented tonight is either mistaken or can be interpreted for creation. So I stand my ground. I still believe the Bible's right. Thank you.
I'll conclude. We're done. Why don't we just stand and we'll pray and we'll go. Some of the very things I've found that people try to take and prove one viewpoint, really it can be taken from a completely different perspective and go for the other. The homology of the organs and bone structures is a great example of that. But at the end of the day, we put our faith in God. Hopefully this has been enlightening to you. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for our young people. Thank you for what we've been talking about. It's information heavy, but God, I pray it's enlightening. God, I pray that you give us a hunger for truth and give us a passion to share that truth with the world around us. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. You're dismissed. Don't forget to get your youth convention payments in this weekend. In Jesus' name.